Now, one of the things that the people who claim that the shroud is a forgery say is that, well, it's a forgery because the carbon-14 test performed in 1988 showed that it was created in the Middle Ages. Okay? I mean, how in the world, if this is really the burial cloth of Jesus, shouldn't it go back 2,000 years? And why is it that the carbon-14 test showed that it was dated to like the 1300s? Well, the problem with the 1988 dating procedure was that the shroud had already been dated in 1982. Now, the Catholic Church gave permission for the Shroud of Turin research project to do the scientific analyses, to take a look at the blood, to take a look at the cloth, to take a look at the images. They did not give permission for carbon-14 tests. There was a carbon-14 test available at that time, which destroyed very little tissue, but still, because it hadn't been thoroughly tested yet, they didn't want any spurious readings, and so they did not give approval for official carbon-14 testing. Well, there was some samples, however, that they were using to test blood, but once they finished testing the blood, they had leftover cloth, and they said, well, while we have the cloth, let's do it and not tell anybody. So they did it. And in 1982, at the University of California Nuclear Facility, they took 2 samples, they dated them, and they got from each piece of thread, one dated from 700 BC to 200 AD, the other was 200 AD to 1000 AD. So within the realm of first century. And now when these results came out, people involved with Shroud of Turin research, which I was at the time. I was working with Dr. Giles Carter, who was a chemist at Eastern. Carter was not a part of STURP, a Shroud of Turin research project. He was an ancillary member of STURP. And so I was a student at that time, and I was working with him as far, not doing a whole lot, but I was kind of his little assistant there, and we did a project and presented the information to the faculty at Eastern, all right? So anyway, I remember he found out about it. Of course, he had to tell me about it. It's like, oh, we dated. It's got a first century date. And so we were so excited when we found out that they were going to officially date it in 1988. We were like, oh, boy, this is going to be awesome because the whole world will know what we know. Because I was doing presentations on the shroud even way back then, but I couldn't publicly tell people that it had been dated because it wasn't legal. Nobody had permission to do it. But just a few insiders knew about this. Now it's public, so I can say it was dated in 1982. It's in the books and everything, but back then nobody knew but us. Well, anyway, and when they came out with that 1260 to 1390 result, I'm telling you, that was a dark day. Everyone was like, it's like suddenly the sun didn't come out and shine. It's like, what happened? How in the world? We were like, how did this happen? How did we end up? How did we get a first century date the first time in 1982, and then in 88 they come up with this goofy 1260 to 1390? The world suddenly didn't make sense. Well, there are a number of theories as to why that might have happened. One theory came out was, well, maybe it was because of biogenic varnish. It had been noted that, over time with mummy samples, for example, bacteria would start eating on the cloth. And if you didn't do a careful washing of your sample, then these bacteria and fungi would then get in there and they would artificially age your cloth. And if you look under the microscope at various fibrils in ancient cloth, even on the shroud, you'll see bugs all over the place. Because, you got a piece of cloth that could be 2,000 years old, you're going to have bugs on it. And if you don't carefully wash those bugs away, then it's going to skew your results. Because carbon dating is basically looking at when was this, whatever carbon-based life form that made up this cloth, when was it alive? When it stopped living, then the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 will alter, and that's what you're measuring. That's how you get a carbon-14 date. So if you've got bugs that keep on living and eating, then that's going to skew your results. So that was one theory that was put forth, that it was because of this biogenic varnish. It's important because even with Egyptian mummies, before we discovered this biogenic varnish problem, that many of these Egyptian cloths were turning out to be younger than the bones. They would date the bones, and the bones would be like 500 years older than the cloth. And nobody knew why that was. Why is it that when you have the cloth, if you date the cloth and the bone separate, the cloth is always younger? And that was because the cloth was covered with all these bugs, and they weren't washing them off, and so it made the cloth seem younger than the bones. Because the previous theory was, well, what's happening is that people are digging up the tomb, finding the mummies, and they're saying, gee, those cloths are really old. Let's rewrap the mummy. 500 years later, and going, oh, stupid. You really think people did that? Nobody did that. But that's what they thought was going on because of this difference. Then when they washed the cloth, they found out that, oh, guess what? It's okay now. Now, the big problem is that, and this was discovered by Ray Rogers, before he died, made this, and I was going to include the video. Maybe I'll put it on the website. But Ray Rogers discovered that the area where we know that the edges on the shroud were actually redone. What happened was when the shroud was going on display, people kept touching it from the edges, and they were getting rather frayed. Also, the shroud has been through a couple of fires. And we have documentation that Clare nuns literally re-wove new edges onto the cloth. I knew about this when when I was 18. By the time I was 19, I think I'd read every book that had ever been published on the shroud. And I knew, from my limited experience, that they had put new edges on it. Well, unfortunately, when they decided to do the dating, Luigi Ganella, who was the scientific advisor to the Cardinal of Turin, felt that this was such a holy object, he did not want it dated at all. And finally, after 10 years of fighting back and forth, he finally agreed as long as he got to take the sample. Well, he's supposed to be the scientific advisor and know something about the shroud. Well, apparently he didn't, because what he did was he took his sample from a lower outer edge, okay, not knowing where the new edges had been put on. We knew that in the Middle Ages they put new edges on. They literally wove it into the cloth. And so, just totally ignoring that, he cuts a sample from the lower outer edge, cuts it into 3 pieces, and gives it to the labs. Now, what was supposed to happen was you're supposed to cut samples from 3 different areas on the cloth and send those in. And they're supposed to be blind. It wasn't blind. Everybody that got a sample knew exactly which one was the shroud, because he didn't bother to undo the 3-to-1 herringbone weaves. Everybody who studies shrouds knows the weave. And so it wasn't even blinded. Everybody knew exactly which one was the shroud sample. It was a horribly botched job. Okay? And so, and basically, I mentioned Ray Rogers because he's the one that actually found the splice point. You can look at it under the microscope, and you can find where the new edge was spliced into it. So we know that what they dated was spliced in later on. So it doesn't matter whether it had biogenic varnish. They dated something that was added on in the Middle Ages. That's what appears to be the case at this time, at least. Okay. All right, now, this is some other important things. If indeed Luigi, not the first Luigi, not the second Luigi, the first Luigi, okay? Not Garlischelli. Garlischelli, not Ganella, because Ganella was the scientific advisor of the Cardinal of Turin. Garlischelli was the Shroud Forgery guy. Now, Garlischelli is saying that what a forger did in the Middle Ages was he took a cloth, he went down to the local store, in Liry, France, bought himself some cloth, and then, he didn't say that, but he's implying it was made right there in France, okay, or in Europe somewhere. They took the cloth, and they put iron oxide on it, they washed it, and they made the image, and they put the blood on it. That's what he's suggesting. It was simple, a simple science project from the 1300s. Well, if his theory is true, then the shroud image was created in Europe and stayed in Europe, because we know the history of the shroud from the 1300s on. We know exactly where it's been. All right? If his theory is true. The problem is that there is overwhelming evidence that the shroud has been in Jerusalem. I mean, not just in Israel, but in Jerusalem. For example, now if you take a look at the Shroud of Turin, imagine this table is the shroud. Now, look at the wood grain on one side of this cloth. Is this really wood? Is it wood all the way through? No. What you see is a laminate. You see laminate on the top, and then the bottom part is steel, obviously. Well, the shroud, the image on the shroud is like this laminate. It's only present on one side of the cloth. If you could shrink yourself down to be small enough and see the cloth as something this thick, on one side only, you'd see that the shroud image only penetrates into the cloth 125 1,000ths of a millimeter. It doesn't go all the way through at any point. Okay? So it just exists on one side. On the other side of the cloth, what we see are heavy concentrations of calcium carbonate. Tons. They notice that. Wow, why do we have all this calcium carbonate? Not on the image side, on the non-image side, calcium carbonate. And you think, well, gee, if it's real, calcium carbonate is what's in limestone. Now, if it is real, think out Israel and Jerusalem. What if you dig a tomb in Jerusalem? You take a look at the terrain and the rock structures that are there. It's limestone. Okay, limestone all over. You dig down, and that's what you make your tomb out of. You're not going to make a tomb out of granite. You know how much work that would be? Okay, you make it out of a soft stone like